Hello and welcome back to the Paleocast Gaming Network for another virtual field trip in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So in this week's video I want to talk to you about how geology has not only shaped the appearance of the planet, but also shaped human history as well. So we're back at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. These salt flats are all that's left of a huge ancient lake called Lake Bonneville. This lake would have been 50,000 square kilometers across and 300 meters deep. If it were around today, Salt Lake City would be completely submerged by it. Now, Lake Bonneville was what we call a terminal lake, so this would mean that it didn't drain to the ocean. Therefore, if the amount of water going into the lake from, say, rivers and rain ever became less than the amount of water that was leaving the lake thanks to evaporation, the lake would slowly shrink, which is exactly what happened here. The lake evaporated, leaving behind all of this salt. Some of these mountains in the distance, they're not really mountains, they're actually just old islands that have been left behind. But we're not actually here to talk about how Lake Bonneville shrank. 17,000 years ago, thanks to the melting of glaciers, Lake Bonneville actually overflowed in one of the most catastrophic floods in geological history. In a matter of weeks, 5,000 cubic kilometers of water, so that's about 2 billion Olympic-sized swimming pools worth, traveled all the way from here in Idaho over 16,000 kilometers before reaching the Pacific Ocean. And I thought we could take our little yellow aeroplane along this route and see what evidence we can find of the Bonneville flood. There must be loads of geological landmarks all across this part of America that don't really make sense on their own until you put them all together. As you can see on my very crude map, the Bonneville flood would have actually followed pre-existing valleys and canyons that still exist today, eroding them and leaving behind massive amounts of boulders and debris, often called melon gravels thanks to signs like this one. 17,000 years ago, Lake Bonneville actually extended all the way into southern Idaho, so that's where our journey begins, in a place called Red Rock Pass. This is where the lake first overflowed and the Bonneville flood began, but to be honest, it's probably the least impressive part of the trip despite this, basically just big piles of gravel and boulders. But the Bonneville flood continued north into what is now called Marsh Creek Valley, so just imagine this entire valley flooded with water from wall to wall over 120 meters deep. And based on the size of some of the boulders that have been found here, it's estimated to have been moving at speeds close to 27 kilometers per hour. Now, when I was planning this trip and plotting the route of the Bonneville flood, I couldn't help but think that I'd seen the line somewhere before. It looked really familiar, until it suddenly clicked. The path the Bonneville flood took lines up almost perfectly with the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail is the 5-month-long route that wagons of colonists took during the westward expansion of the United States from Missouri to Oregon in the 1800s. If you were to take this journey on foot, you would probably find graffiti from colonists and some of the boulders dumped by the Bonneville flood, and even ruts in the ground from where wagons had repeatedly eroded the earth. Now, I'm no historian, well, okay, maybe in a very, very broad sense, but I want to get across the fact that the history of the Oregon Trail is so complicated because a lot of it has been romanticized since. Really, the Oregon Trail epitomized the spread of disease and ecological devastation, and of course the deaths and displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans, a lot of which just gets glossed over when the people in power still benefit from this kind of colonial narrative. And well, we have very similar problems in geology. There are several geological landmarks that we will encounter on today's trip that are tied directly to colonialism, that have since been renamed by so-called explorers and discoverers who were probably geologists. So as we go through with this, I just want to make sure that you are aware of this extra bit of history. But the big question for today's trip is, did the Bonneville flood create the Oregon Trail, at least west of Red Rock Pass? It's hard to get over just how much influence geology has had on human history. We've talked before about how geology defined the English and Scottish border, and I'm currently planning a video about how geology can even influence voting patterns, especially in the US. On one hand, water is always going to follow the path of least resistance. In a minute, the flood's route is going to connect with the pre-existing Snake River Valley, one of the steepest rivers in America, and follow it for most of the journey, so maybe humans were also bound to take this route? Okay, so this is the Snake River Valley that I was just talking about, and the flood followed this west all across southern Idaho, and I guess now so are we. And we're just coming up on our first proper stop. This is Massacre Rock State Park, where we have gigantic chunks of basalt several meters across that have been carried and littered across the edges of the river by the flood. Today it's a state park. There are barbecues and restrooms and something called disc golf, whatever that is. But again, I thought it would be important to look at the history of this place as well. But if you look at the park website, the information on the history is pretty rubbish. Massacre Rocks derived its name from an immigrant wagon party skirmish. Like, oh, is that it? Well, after doing some deeper reading, I found so many conflicting accounts. On one hand, most sources will tell you various satisfying stories about how the area was a treacherous route perfect for an ambush, and in 1862, supposedly a band of Native Americans attacked a group of colonists that came through here. But then, more recent sources will claim that there was no massacre at all, and the name was just made up to drum up business. But what you've got to remember is that this is all coming from that colonial viewpoint that I was talking about earlier. It was only after I did more digging, I found the whole state park may effectively be covering up the real identity of the killers, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans. And I know this sounds like I'm going way off topic, but like I said, I didn't want to just gloss over this information, but I wasn't expecting it to be so conflicting and so, well, horrifying. I think it really demonstrates how there's more to teaching geology than just, hey, look at this pretty rock. They don't exist in a vacuum, especially when you're on the Oregon Trail. A little further along, we can start to see some more effects that the Bonneville flood had on the Snake River Valley. So firstly, the flood literally lowered the floor of the river and steepened the valley sides, creating this really cool gorge. It also scoured the bedrock on the valley sides. You can see it most clearly where the farmland just sort of stops and gives way to this sort of brownish red rock. That just shows how wide the Bonneville flood was when it came through here. Oh, and by the way, the bedrock is actually the Columbia River flood basalt, which we've actually covered on the channel before as well, so I won't go into too much detail, but basically it's just made up of hundreds of layers of solidified lava flows, technically from the Yellowstone volcano. Yeah, Yellowstone has moved a few times, kind of. Watch that video if you want to know what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, as we go further downstream, the erosion just gets even more dramatic. It's practically demolished the landscape around Twin Falls, creating the waterfall I just mentioned, and also these huge gorges. It's so cool. Okay, I think the best way to do this is to just keep skipping ahead, otherwise this video is just going to be hours and hours of repeatedly flying over the same stretches of river saying, oh look, gravel. So we've got ahead about 50 kilometers, and we're just coming up on this bend where you can see the channel suddenly widens. That's because we're no longer going over the tough volcanic basalt, but instead over this much softer sedimentary rock. And somewhere down there is the Hageman fossil beds. There's fossil saber-tooths, mastodons, bears, camels, ground sloths, and even horses, which is super weird. Like, did you know that horses were found in North America millions of years ago, then they died out, then colonists reintroduced them? Like, it's genuinely scary how much rapid control humans have over, like, the change of global ecosystems. As someone who studies how ecosystems change over millions of years, that's just kind of scary, to be completely honest with you. Oh, by the way, I should stress that the animals of the Hageman fossil bed died like 3 million years before the Bonneville flood. It wasn't the flood that killed them, but the flood created the valley, revealing the fossils to the surface. I also bring it up because most sources will tell you that a cattle rancher discovered the site in the 1920s, but in reality the Shoshone had actually already studied and documented the petrified bones decades, if not centuries prior. Okay, so we've travelled another 70 kilometers downstream, I think, and this is probably one of the weirdest things we're going to see. We've seen a lot of rocky crags in the distance, but over there we have this very weird, smooth, crested hill. That's the best I can describe it without giving away what it is. That is Microsoft Flight Simulator's attempt at rendering Bruneau Dunes State Park, the tallest freestanding dune in North America. A sand dune just sitting in the middle of nowhere is one of those things that doesn't really make a lot of sense, until you remember there was a massive flood that dumped tons of gravel and sand nearby. You'd expect that most sand dunes would migrate as they're pushed by the wind, but this one seems to be sort of trapped in this basin where it's probably going to stay for many more thousands of years. Okay, really jumping ahead now, we're about a third of the way in and we're just coming up on a place called Farewell Bend. It's basically a massive point bar. You find these things in rivers all the time where the flow has decelerated on the corner of a meander and dropped the rocks it was carrying on the way. This one was created by the Bonneville flood, so it's of course gigantic. It's so huge that people actually live on it. It was of course renamed Farewell Bend by the Oregon Trail colonists, as it was here where the river, and therefore our flood path, briefly part ways with the Oregon Trail as they sort of left the river and worked their way around into Oregon through easier terrain. And again, bear in mind the way the history is presented here is so in favour of the colonists that there's very little to criticise their actions, their violence and trespassing. But like I was saying, even though our two routes break off here, this is the clearest example of how the Bonneville flood impacted the history of this region. The reason they didn't keep following the river is because just around the corner is what they called Hell's Canyon. So here the Snake River Valley and also the Bonneville flood veered into much tougher crystalline rock of the Rocky Mountains, creating this incredibly narrow, deep, V-shaped canyon. It's actually one of the deepest valleys in North America, more than 500 meters deeper than the Grand Canyon in most places. It's neat to think that the Bonneville flood so far has been responsible for the deepest canyon and the tallest dune in the country. I really love this place, it looks so amazing, and if you were here 17,000 years ago, it would have been just insane. The floodwaters would have almost filled the valley, not only deepening it, but dumping more beds of sand and gravel hundreds of meters above the current modern day water level, which is still there to this day. So after about 250 kilometers of this awesome canyon, we come out into the city of Lewiston. That's a very interesting bit of geology here, especially if you're into weird sedimentary structures like the nerds I'm sure you all are. The river splits as a tributary called Clearwater River joins the mainstream. Pretty basic river setup, I guess. But geologists discovered that roughly 17,000 years ago, this river briefly ran backwards, which again is super unusual. Water running uphill doesn't tend to happen. Unless, of course, it just so happened to coincide with this massive flood that came crashing through here and pushed the water back upstream for several kilometers, and again, leaving behind these really unusual sedimentary structures. Okay, really skipping ahead now, because frankly, there's not really a lot to say here. We've reached the final stretch of our journey where the Bonneville flood finally merged with the Columbia River Gorge at Wallula Gap, giving it clear and easy access to the Pacific Ocean. And it's also here that we rejoin with the Oregon Trail as they sort of made their way down here too towards Oregon City. And yeah, like I said, there's not really a lot else to say here, so we're really skipping ahead. The Ice Age floods did not create this gorge. In fact, this river is actually older than the Cascade Mountains that are all around us now. The river was here first, then when the mountains formed and this whole place was uplifted, the river simply stayed in the same height, the same place, as the valley walls grew past it, which is just so crazy. And yeah, even back then, it was more than wide enough for our flood to pass through, doing very little to really impact it. And then finally, there you have it, we're at the Pacific Ocean. There's the really amazing bridge across to Astoria, and there's a car driving under the bridge in the water. That's fantastic. Thank you, Flight Simulator, for that. So, after that whistle-stop tour, did the Bonneville flood create the Oregon Trail, or is it just a massive coincidence? On one hand, I think it's insane to say that just one geological event is responsible. If anything, it's the accumulation of all the geological processes in this area that has driven this history. But it's neat to think how differently history could have turned out if this flood didn't happen. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this very jam-packed episode. We covered quite a lot in a relatively short period of time, so I really appreciate you sticking with me. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. And as always, if you have any other ideas for virtual field trips or landmarks that you would like to see, just let us know. I will see you next time, and goodbye.